Now, is that the email that you've been referring to today?
Yes, sir.
This is an email. It's from Robert Callen, who you knew to be the chief of police of the Jersey City Police Department, correct?
Yes.
And it's dated April 28, 2014. So that would have been approximately 14 days after the Skyway detail started, correct?
Yes.
I'm sorry, it actually would be 18 days, correct?
Yes.
And the email is written to James Shea. Do you know what his position was at that time?
He's the director of public safety.
And the subject is Pulaski Skyway, correct?
Yes.
And there is a kind of a signature line at the end, and that also indicates it's from Chief Callen, correct?
Yes.
Can you read the email for the record, please?
Yes. As discussed on Saturday, the Pulaski Skyway is more than a series of regular jobs that tend to run smoothly when thrown together under a supervision. The Skyway is a complex and evaluated project in terms of continuous policy and changes, conditions, as demonstrated by the consent of adjustments to the plan. While these projects need command control, as Captain Astley has been doing. Amongst his regular command duties overseeing the ESU and SPB, Captain Astley has been overseeing both the morning and afternoon Pulaski details, resulting in 12-hour work days. To pay the overtime, Captain Astley would be a budget buster. I advise that I did the math, and there'll be an overage of administrative funds to be paid to Captain Astley. Pay Captain Astley, advised, was agreeable to work for the hourly off-duty rate, which is half of his overtime rate, and he will be compensated in this matter today. Respectfully, Chief Callen.
Just a couple of very quick questions about the email. First of all, do you know when you received this? It must have been forwarded to you at some time, correct?
No, it was actually given to Mark Timmons.
Okay, and then Mr. Timmons brought it to your attention?
Yes, he showed it to me after I started.
Do you know, and you might not recall this given the passage of time, but do you know approximately when Mr. Timmons showed this to you?
No, I don't recall.
The second line of the email reads in part as follows: the Skyway is a complex and evolving project. That was true in your experience, was it not?
Yes.
This was a lot for your office to handle with all the paperwork coming in, certainly.
Yes.
And things changed from time to time when it came to how the Office of Off-Duty Employment would handle various issues, correct?
Yes.
For example, as Mr. Garrigan had indicated to you earlier, the very first week of the Skyway project, vouchers weren't even being signed by supervisors, correct?
Correct.
And for some reason, that practice changed after the first week, although it wasn't always followed, correct?
Correct.
And another example of how the project evolved was that it was your understanding that it began with 52 posts, and as we saw from one of the master sheets that you were shown later today, the number of posts decreased pretty dramatically. I think it was by September of 2014, correct?
Yes.
So it was an evolving project. Yes?
Yes.
The other issue I'd like to address with you has to do with something you testified to earlier. You said that you thought that Captain Astley was entitled to overtime pay for his work as Skyway commander. Do you remember testifying to that?
Yes.
And in fact, what Chief Callen says is in his email is that if Joe was actually paid overtime, it would have busted the budget on this project, correct?
Yes.
So as a result, Joe didn't get paid his overtime rate. What he got paid was the off-duty rate for a supervisor, correct?
Correct.
Okay. So that would have been $60 an hour, correct?
Yes.
And as indicated in Chief Callen's email, and it must have been your understanding from the email, that $60 an hour was half of what he would have been entitled to if he were paid by overtime rates, correct?
Yes.
So although he was the Skyway commander, he was in charge of the entire project, isn't that right?
Yes.
He was getting paid, he was not getting paid overtime, and in fact, he was getting paid the rate that a supervisor gets paid, and all that supervisor has to do is check on 13 posts, correct?
Yes.
Prior to your grand jury testimony, you hadn't even seen the MOU, the Memorandum of Understanding, correct?
Correct.
So you didn't know that the project consisted more than just these 52 posts, correct?
Correct.
After being shown the MOU, you now realize that the project included having 55 officers and 2 emergency responders, correct?
Yes.
That's more than the 52 posts, right?
Yes.
That those officers were to be assigned to things like vehicular detour routes to patrol them to make sure that the parking areas were clear, correct?
Yes.
Those officers were also to be assigned to patrol pedestrian detour routes too, correct?
Yes.
Now, there's nothing on this master sheet to indicate that that work had to be done by any of the police officers, correct?
Correct.
So there's also nothing on this master sheet to indicate that anybody in particular was being assigned to supervise that kind of work, correct? You agree that as Skyway commander of the project, Captain Askales could have supervised that work, correct?
Yes.
Captain Askales could have assigned another officer to supervise that work, correct?
Yes.
Lieutenant Chesler could have also supervised that work, correct?
Yes.
And as the commander and as the XO, the executive officer, if Lieutenant Chesler or Captain Askales assigned someone to do that extra work, you would agree that they had full and complete authority to sign that officer's voucher, correct?
Yes.
There was no standard SOP, there was no regulation, there was no rule that prevented them from assigning officers to do that additional work, correct?
Correct.
Nothing in writing to prevent them from assigning another officer to even supervise that work, correct?
Correct.
Nothing in writing that prevented them from signing the vouchers for that work, correct?
Correct.
Okay. You also identified during your direct and cross-examination a number of vouchers that Captain Askales had signed as Skyway Commander.
Yes.
And that would be for the work that he did in accordance with the email that we just talked about that was sent by Chief Cowan, correct?
Yes.
And you also testified that when he signed a voucher as commander, he didn't have to put a location, correct?
Correct.
If you were an officer who was on one of the posts, it was your understanding the policy and procedure was that they had to put a location, correct?
Yes.
No location, no pay, correct?
Correct.
Same thing with strike that. When you talked about, when you testified about Captain Askales not having to have a location on his Skyway Commander voucher, I recall you testifying, you can correct me if I'm wrong, that he didn't have to put a location because he was roving. He could be roving. You
Yes.
recall that?
Yes.
So what that means is there was no location that he had to put down because he could have been driving around the city making sure the cones were out, correct?
Yes.
He could have been driving around the city making sure that the barrels and the mobile signs were up, correct?
Yes.
he could have been driving around the city making sure that the supervisors were doing their job, correct?
Yes.
He could have been driving around the city to make sure that everything was being done well at the posts, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So he didn't have to put down the location on his voucher for those reasons, correct?
Correct.
Now I know that you didn't start receiving the master sheet until, I believe it was October of 2014.
Yes.
But you were aware prior to that time that the police department was having difficulty manning all 52 of the posts. You understood that, didn't you?
Yes.
In fact, it was a common occurrence, wasn't it?
Yes.
Now, this voucher that we have up as D3 is a voucher dated June 13th, 2014. And I believe you addressed this earlier, but when it comes to the number of uncovered posts that day, there were 19 uncovered posts throughout the city, correct?
Actually, more, but it's 2 shifts.
Yeah, I'm just talking about the morning.
Yeah, the morning, yes, 19.
And there was one less in the afternoon.
Yes.
So, because there were 19 uncovered posts in the morning, Captain Ascalise could have been driving to those uncovered posts to see what was going on at those locations, right?
Yes.
And it was within Captain Ascalise's authority, was it not, if he wanted to assign another officer whose job it was to go from post to post that was open to make sure that traffic was running smoothly. If not, jump in, get out of his car, direct some traffic until things started moving along, then go from post to post.
Yes.
That officer would have been roving the same way or similarly to the manner in which Captain Ascalise was roving, correct?
Yes.
An officer, in addition to doing that during the day, could have had his responsibility to set up cones or to make sure the signs were in place as well, correct?
Yes.
So they could have been roving as well.
Yes.
And there was nothing to prevent either Captain Ascalise or Lieutenant Chesler from signing the vouchers for those officers, correct?
Correct.
And those officers would not have had a specific supervisor assigned to them that morning, at least not one of the 4 listed on the master sheet, correct?
Excuse me.
During your testimony today, and even yesterday, you identified a whole series of vouchers, predominantly vouchers from Michael Maetti, 2 vouchers from Officer O'Neill that Captain Ascalise signed. Do you recall that?
Yes.
You also indicated earlier today that on many occasions you would have vouchers come in that were filled out by the officer but were not signed by a supervisor, correct?
Yes.
You also testified, if I recall correctly, that you don't have an independent recollection of what vouchers or whose vouchers they were that came in that were unsigned by a supervisor, correct?
Yes.
So all of the vouchers you identified yesterday and today could have been vouchers from Officer Maetti and Officer O'Neill that Officer Ascalise signed. I'm sorry, that Officer Ascalise's name eventually appeared on, correct?
Yes.
And if they were unsigned, they would have been, according to your policy, sent back either to Lieutenant Goldrich or to maybe even Captain Ascalise to sign, correct?
Yes.
So they might not have been signed until days, even weeks after the
Yes.
work was done, correct?
Yes.
55 police officers with equipment, do you see that?
Yes.
including but not limited to service weapons, and vehicles required for their work as uniformed traffic directors. You see that?
Yes.
Now, no officer standing on one of those 52 posts needed a vehicle, correct?
Correct.
They stood outside and directed traffic, right?
Yes.
And the agreement talks not only about this post that drive the vehicular detour routes, correct?
Yes.
It also talks very specifically that Jersey City would provide the vehicles required for their work as uniformed traffic officers, correct?
Yes.
So, as you sit here now, and by the way, let me just take a step back. Having gone through this process yesterday and then today during cross-examination, would you agree that the paperwork is not what you thought it was coming in here?
Correct.
Correct, okay. So, having gone through this process and recognizing this, is it now clear to you, as a veteran of law enforcement, as a functioning human being, that this agreement contemplated there would be officers moving about to deal with various issues in the city?
Yes.
Thank you. This agreement also talked about the various ways that the monies would be monitored, correct?
Yes.
And if you go to go to page 5, you see where C?
Yes.
It's the continuation of that section. And we've heard your testimony about the 15th day of every month, the fully completed payment voucher, and required backup as outlined in the municipal police agreement procedure. You see that?
Yes.
All right. Do you know what that is?
Yes.
What is the municipal police agreement procedure?
That's the MUA agreement procedures.
It's the what?
That's the municipal agreement with the state regarding to payroll and billing.
So the municipal police agreement procedure is what's in here?
Yes.
That's your understanding what that means?
Yes.
Okay, so then there's no other document, there's no other SOP. I'm going to draw that. You know what an SOP is?
Yes.
In all your time in law enforcement, SOP is a standard operating procedure, correct?
Yes.
Details exactly what is expected from an officer as it relates to a particular assignment they may get, correct?
Yes.
Detective Bureau, when you worked in corrections, you had pods you worked on, whatever it was, correct?
Yes.
Okay. There's no specific SOP about this DOT detail, correct?
Correct.
No rules or regulations?
Correct.
Okay, so to be clear then, you're referring back to the entirety of, you're saying the municipal police agreement procedure is what's contained in here.
Yes.
And whatever's contained in here is whatever's in here, but you didn't even know about this until after you testified in the grand jury in May of 2016.
Yes.
Okay, and what you knew was the process by which you dealt with getting these documents and then setting them up for payment, correct?
Yes.
All right, as you testified about. Joe Ascalise was indicted for filling out the pay voucher for Mike Mahoney on that day.
No, I was not.
Okay, well, you know you're here for various indictments, correct?
Yes.
And you know you've been shown certain dates, correct?
Yes.
He also filled one out for Mike O'Neill, correct?
Yes.
Were you aware that he's alleged to be in a co-conspiracy with Mike O'Neill as well?
No.
Judge, I'm going to object to the questions calling for legal conclusion from the witness.
I'm asking if he's aware of allegations. Judge.
No, yeah, exactly. He's allegations that he's involved in a conspiracy. Mr. O'Neill is not indicted for May 1st, 2014. He's not indicted. He's not indicted for that date, and that's not for this witness to really address, Judge. Whether he's indicted or not for this date, whether there's evidence to establish that he was there or not there on that date. For the record, Your Honor, I can state that Mahoney, there were phone records at the time. Those don't exist now. However, Mahoney still, Judge, has indicated he's not there on that particular day. Mike O'Neill is not indicted for May 1st, and this witness has really no knowledge, nor is he competent to testify with respect to the legal basis for any charges against any of his clients.
Judge,
Any of the defendants.
if we're...
He's not...
Okay. Excuse me. I will... Let me withdraw the line of questioning as it relates to the May 1st issue. Clearly, do your records indicate that my client's forms were signed by Joe Ascalise on that date?
Yes.
And does it clearly indicate that my client was paid for the work he performed on that date?
Yes.
Okay. Now, let's take a look at June 3rd. You got June 3rd? Okay.
Yes.
You have June 3rd?
Yes, sir.
Now, you were shown a series of documents by Mr. Garrigan that demonstrated instances where the quote-unquote patrol chart, the activity log, omitted an officer whose pay voucher was signed by someone else and they were paid, correct?
Yes.
And that's what occurs in this instance, correct? Go to the second page.
There's no second page.
You don't have S8B?
I have S8D. Yes.
Okay. So, here you have a supervisor, a guy by the name of Brown,
Yes.
and you don't see O'Neill's name on there, correct?
Correct.
And then, go to S8D, and you see O'Neill, and signed by Ascalise, correct?
Yes.
And you just were shown, I don't want to go over this again, numerous instances of that before, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so, did anybody ever come back and ask you, oh, let me withdraw it this way. You said Joshua came in and got all these documents and statements?
Yes.
Okay. Did anyone ever come back and say, what about this day or that day? What about this supervisor or that supervisor?
No.
No. But essentially the pattern here where a supervisor doesn't see somebody and omits them from their quote-unquote activity log, off-duty activity sheet / patrol log, is the same pattern we see on June 3rd with regard to with regard to O'Neill, correct?
Yes.
And to short circuit it, we go to June 6th. That's S9. And if you look at S9C,
Yes.
you've got Neil Donnelly, correct?
Yes.
You don't see O'Neill's name?
No.
And you go to S9F, you see a voucher for O'Neill,
Yes.
signed by Ascalise?
Yes.
And we saw that pattern with numerous other officers before, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And as you sit here now, no one ever came to you, asked a question, and said, gee, we're indicting this guy for the same thing that happened on numerous other occasions. Can you explain that, please?
No.
That's all I have to say.